The Dandy Dozen NFL Modern. We're talking 80s and 90s NFL. Oh, yeah. Happy hobby. I'm David Gonson. Once again, if you're a sports card collector and you're working with a limited budget, this is the YouTube series for you. That's what we talk about here. And today we're talking about which players you should collect from that modern era of the NFL. We're talking about the 1980s decade and the 90s decade. Now, we already did the vintage, which vintage players you should collect. That's like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's this video right here, so make sure you check that one out. And eventually, we're going to do the millennials one. No, I'm just kidding. We don't have a screen because we didn't make the video yet. But eventually, we'll be doing the millennials, which is from the 2000s forward. Spoiler alert, pretty sure Tom Brady will be in that one. So what is the Dandy Dozen? This is basically me just choosing 12 players from a specific era of card collecting that I think you should try to get some of their cards. You don't have to get their rookie card. You can get their second-year card or the third-year card. But really, it's all about getting cards of that player because he's a highly collectible player. So you get one of his early cards, and then you can upgrade eventually and get maybe an earlier card at some point. Or maybe you get a card, and then you get a better grade of that card at some point. So it's all about upgrading your collection, and this is one of the ways to do it. Get the most collectible guys from specific eras in those sports. I already made some mistakes in the Dandy Dozen Vintage, by the way. A lot of people yelling at me for not having Dick Butkus in there, probably in place of Fred Biletnikoff. And then Joe Green. Between Joe Green and Franco Harris, although with Franco Harris dying, I think maybe that did move him up a little bit collectible-wise. So I'll give you the Dick Butkus one, though. Dick Butkus should have been in the Vintage. We've already done the Dandy Dozen for Vintage Baseball and the Dandy Dozen for Modern Baseball. We've even done the Dandy Dozen for Millennials Baseball. Sorry, Frank. We had to put that over, Frank. Millennials Baseball. We even did that one. So make sure you check out those videos as well. I have links in the description. We're talking modern 1980s and 90s NFL players you should collect. The Dandy Dozen. 12 players you should collect. Number one, it's not really a big surprise, but Joe Montana. I mean, Joe Montana was the biggest athlete of the 80s. Sorry, Michael Jordan. He was more of the 90s. It was all about Joe Montana in the 80s. 4 Super Bowls, 3 Super Bowl MVPs. This guy was Tom Brady before Tom Brady. As a matter of fact, Tom Brady was at one of Joe Montana's games, The Catch with Dwight Clark. Tom Brady was at that game. So you got to give some credit to Joe Montana for that one. Also, little known fact, Huey Lewis in the News and the San Francisco 49ers were very symbiotic. Is that the word? They both did a lot of stuff with each other. Huey Lewis in the News was always at 49ers games singing the national anthem, and they sang backup on the song Hip to Be Square. So when it's going hip, hip, so hip to be square, that's them singing in the background. That's them. 49ers. Joe Montana, Dwight Clark, a couple other guys. If you get a chance to watch the Joe Montana documentary on Peacock, that streaming service, I suggest you do it. It is awesome. It is a fantastic documentary, especially if you're a guy that lived through the 80s and 90s. Love that era of the NFL. You're going to love this documentary, I promise. All right, so number 2, we spent a lot of time on number 1. But who's number 2? It's not a big surprise. It's Jerry Rice. It's Joe Montana's battery mate. He's the guy he threw to. Jerry Rice, the greatest wide receiver in NFL history. I don't think it's debated at all. I don't think anybody really disagrees with that. 3-time Super Bowl champ. 2-time Offensive Player of the Year. The Sporting News named him the second best NFL player ever behind Jim Brown. I think I think that came out in 2010. I think by now, Tom Brady would be in that ahead of Jerry Rice, maybe ahead of Jim Brown. I'm not going to start an argument there. But Jerry Rice, top 3 player ever on the NFL. And for fantasy football guys, this is something I wanted to share with you. There is no player that has ever been drafted in the first round of fantasy drafts more than Jerry Rice. He's a wide receiver. This is back when running backs ruled the world, and Jerry Rice was a first-round pick for a billion years in a row. He was a superstar, fantasy stud, and you love to get him every year. I would venture to say that makes him the greatest fantasy football player ever, and that makes him a top 2 collectible guy for me. All right, we're moving on to number 3, John Elway, the Denver Broncos superstar quarterback. A big deal in the 80s, a big deal in the 90s. Won 2 Super Bowls in the 90s. He was in 5 Super Bowls overall. 3 losers, but 2 winners at the end. Retired as a Super Bowl champion. That's a pretty big deal. He's a 9-time Pro Bowler, and he was the #1 pick in the 1983 draft by the Baltimore Colts, who would eventually trade him, of course, to the Denver Broncos. Now, interestingly, John Elway was also the first pick for the Yankees in the 1981 baseball draft, but it was actually a second rounder. They didn't have a first-round pick. So the 52nd pick in that draft overall was John Elway to the Yankees. And then the 1982 baseball draft, the Yankees used their 50th pick to pick Bo Jackson. John Elway and Bo Jackson could have been on the same team, if you can imagine that. It was a baseball team. But still, they could have been on the same team with Don Mattingly, which would have been pretty awesome too. But John Elway went to football. Bo Jackson went to college to play football and baseball there, so they didn't really get him. The Yankees drafted Bo Jackson as a shortstop, by the way. Okay, I'm getting off track here. So John Elway, the #3 most collectible player in the modern era. #4, his draft mate, Dan Marino. A lot of people might swap those guys back and forth, but really, John Elway with those 2 Super Bowl titles, he gets the nod ahead of Marino. But Marino in the 80s was really a bigger deal than John Elway. Marino was a superstar. He got the NFL record for passing touchdowns in his second year in Miami. That's pretty amazing. 48 touchdown passes, and that was like more than 20 years after that record had already been set by Y.A. Tittle. Marino was actually the #1 draft pick by the USFL, by the LA Express, but he ended up choosing to play for the Miami Dolphins, who picked him in the middle of the first round. And when Marino broke Y.A. Tittle's record, it was 12 touchdowns more than what the previous passing touchdown record was. And of course, eventually Tom Brady broke Dan Marino's record, and Peyton Manning after that, and blah, blah, blah. But still, that Marino breaking Y.A. Tittle's record was a big deal. In the early 80s, Marino was still featuring the running back. All right, #5, another quarterback. This is the 4th quarterback on this list. Steve Young, connected to Joe Montana. And this is a fun one because you can get his NFL rookie card pretty cheap, relatively cheap, like $20 raw. You can get that card. It's a 1986 Topps card. It's just like the Jerry Rice rookie card, that same design. However, his true rookie card, what I consider his true rookie card, is his 1984 USFL card. That's really his true rookie card. Topps produced it, but it was just in a different league. So his NFL true rookie card is 86, though. Steve Young was second in the Heisman voting behind Mike Rozier of Nebraska in 1983. He's a 3-time Super Bowl champ. He was a 1-time Super Bowl MVP, 2-time NFL MVP. And it's amazing the career he put together when you think of having 2 years in the USFL, 2 stinky years with the Buccaneers, 4 years as Joe Montana's backup, essentially, and then his NFL career really started. He ended up leading the NFL in passing 4 different times. He's a top 5 collectible guy for me, especially when you consider you can get 2 rookie cards for this one guy. All right, move on to #6. Finally, our first running back for this list. Even though it was a running back heavy decade in the 1980s and the 90s, a lot of good running backs in the 90s, 1980s. #6, Barry Sanders. Considered the greatest running back in NFL history after Jim Brown. A lot of people may consider him better than Jim Brown, but I'm going to say no. And actually, a lot of people even think Walter Payton, maybe even Emmitt Smith are better than Barry Sanders. But anybody that watched Barry Sanders play, I mean, this guy was breaking more ankles than Michael Jordan at that time. He was just a monster to tackle. He was so tiny, it was tough to get a hard hit on, like a direct shot on him. He was just so shifty, so quick in that backfield. And then once he got in the open field, he was gone. He played against the Buccaneers. I remember him losing a shoe and just running with a sock flopping against the Buccaneers. It was bad. It was a long touchdown run, too. Very, very disheartening as a Buccaneers fan. Barry would, of course, eventually retire early, just like Jim Brown. It really kept that mystique like Jim Brown. And really, it saved us from having 2 years of Barry Sanders in the Arizona Cardinals uniform. No offense, Emmitt. He's a junior at college at Oklahoma State. He rushed for a record, a still record, 2,628 yards with 37 touchdowns in 11 games. That's still a record. And he won the Heisman that year, of course. And the year before, he sat behind Thurman Thomas. Can you imagine Barry Sanders sitting on the bench behind anybody? That's pretty amazing. But Thurman Thomas is pretty good. Just think of that backfield, though. Thurman Thomas and Barry Sanders. That has to be the all-time greatest NFL backfield. To me, the only one I can even think of that's close, and it isn't close really at all. It reminds me of like a modern-day version of that is Todd Gurley and Nick Chubb, both at Georgia, with Nick Chubb behind Todd Gurley. That was a pretty amazing duo. Not even close to Barry and Thurman, of course, but it gives you a modern version of what that was. Number 7, move on to Randy Moss, the guy I considered the second best wide receiver in the history of the NFL. Now, back in the late 90s, the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s, the wide receiver's third year was considered their breakout year. That was when people expected wide receivers to start breaking out. Statistically, it is shown that that was the year that receivers would suddenly become much better than they were. Not the case with Randy Moss. First year, rookie year, 17 touchdowns, sets the NFL rookie record with 17 touchdown catches with the Minnesota Vikings in 1998. Took off like a rocket. Then, of course, in 2007, he sets the NFL receiving touchdown record with 23 with the Patriots, with Tom Brady setting the passing touchdown record. In 1998, when Randy Moss came into the league, fantasy magazines did not have him as the best wide receiver, the best rookie wide receiver to draft that year. That was Kevin Dyson. They did not have Fred Taylor as the best running back to draft that year. That was Curtis Enis. Fantasy magazines did not have Peyton Manning as the best rookie quarterback to draft that year. That was Ryan Leaf. So think about that. Fantasy magazine was touting Ryan Leaf, Curtis Enis, and Kevin Dyson. And then we had Peyton Manning, Fred Taylor, and Randy Moss in that same class. It's just amazing to me, like how amazing those guys were and how bad those guys were. Just that juxtaposition, pretty crazy. All right, number 8. Eric Dickerson set the NFL rushing record in 1984 with 2,105 rushing yards. That's still a record today. What's interesting is he did that in 1984, his second year in the league. The same year, the same sophomore year, as Dan Marino set the passing touchdown record. That's pretty amazing. Number 9, we go to LT Lawrence Taylor, not LaDainian Tomlinson, not yet. Spoiler alert in the next one. Lawrence Taylor in this one, though. LT took the league by storm. He changed the way the game is played. Whenever that happens, whenever somebody we have to change everything. Steph Curry for basketball. The whole league changes because of this one player. That he's definitely collectible in my book. And Lawrence Taylor, while he's a defensive player, he's actually the only defensive player on this list. Shocker. But the fact that he's a defensive player that was a superstar in New York, I think helped his collectability a lot. And he was controversial. He was kind of crazy. He had drug problems, a whole lot of stuff going on. And he was just so mean, just so angry. But all of that, I think, really did help his collectability. All right, number 10, double digits, Emmitt Smith. My guy, I'm a Gators fan. Love Emmitt Smith. I had to become more of a Cowboys fan with Emmitt Smith on the Cowboys. It blew me away that he wasn't a top 5 pick like Barry Sanders the year before. Instead, he dropped all the way to 17th for the Cowboys. That just blew me away. He ended up winning 3 Super Bowls, and he went on to break Walter Payton's career rushing record. So along with Jerry Rice, Emmitt Smith is the only non-kicker to have scored more than 1,000 points in the NFL. All right, number 11, we'll move on to Marshall Faulk. Eric Dickerson was traded from the Rams to the Colts. Marshall Faulk was traded from the Colts to the Rams. Now, his rookie card with the Colts came in 1994. He was the 2nd overall pick behind Dan Wilkinson. How'd that happen? Yeah, that's right. Marshall Faulk is one of only 3 players to rush for at least 10,000 career yards and catch 5,000 receiving yards in his career. Now, what's interesting is he's one of only 3 players to do that, but he's the only player of those 3 to rush for over 12,000 yards and catch over 6,000 receiving yards. Faulk was a Super Bowl champ, NFL Offensive Player of the Year 3 different times. And again, for fantasy players, he was one of the greatest all-time fantasy running backs ever. Number 12. Look, I know a lot of you are pulling your hair out. You're like, where's Bo Jackson? Bo knows. Dandy doesn't. What's happening? Relax. Bo is over on the modern baseball Dandy doesn't list. Sorry, Frank. I woke Frank up. He was a little... He loves Bo. It makes sense. But number 12 in this list, Troy Aikman. Again, many of you are pulling your hair out. Troy Aikman, this is one of the most controversial Hall of Fame players in existence right now. A lot of people don't think he should be in the NFL Hall of Fame. That's a different argument altogether. For me, he's a 3-time Super Bowl champ. He was a number 1 overall pick for the Dallas Cowboys, America's team. One of the most popular teams in the history of the NFL, that early 90s Dallas Cowboys team with Emmitt, Michael Irvin. Just that offensive loan was amazing. Plus, he's in the public eye currently as a Monday Night Football analyst. That gives him a lot of collectability, a lot of eyes on him. A lot of people thinking about him, just like Terry Bradshaw or like Steve Young. A lot of people see him and remember him and start thinking about him and want those cards. It makes sense. Aikman's only real sin was that his rookie card came at the beginning of the junk wax era. So people kind of look at those cards as not as collectible. They certainly are collectible, but had his rookie card come in like 1982, much bigger deal, I think, personally. All right, so let's talk about the players that just missed. I know you're screaming at me about a handful of them, so let's get to them. Brett Favre, of course. A lot of people probably think of him as much more collectible than Troy Aikman. It'd be tough to argue with that. For me, I didn't want to have him on the list. It seems like his collectability is kind of in the past year or so, just for some of his off the field stuff. A couple other quarterbacks a lot of people might be thinking of. Jim Kelly for the Buffalo Bills, been to 4 Super Bowls. That's pretty awesome. Phil Simms, the Giants, again, a couple Super Bowls for him. I don't argue against those guys as much as I argue for the other guys being a little bit more collectible than they are. Another running back that probably could have made this list is Jerome Bettis. He just so close he just couldn't make it. And 3 more defensive players that just missed: Reggie White, Ronnie Lott, and Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders might climb into that top 12 eventually. Coach right now, head coach for the Colorado Buffaloes. Maybe eventually moves into the NFL, becomes a head coach in the NFL. Who knows? But his collectability right now is not Dandy Dozen status. So there you have it. That's my Dandy Dozen for the modern players. Go ahead and hit me in the comments. Tell me where I'm a great big idiot. Tell me where I missed, where I'm wrong, who I forgot about. Tell me which ones I shouldn't have had up in that top 12. I want to hear it. So coming up next, of course, is going to be the NFL Dandy Dozen Millennials. All the players from 2000s to now. Who do you think is going to make it on that list? All right, so whether you've been collecting for years or maybe this is your first time dipping into the modern era, the 80s, 90s football players, whatever you do, make sure you have a happy hobby.